Well, for more, let's go now to Washington and speak with Gene Policinski, president of the Newsroom Institute and co-founding editor, USA Today. And Gene, let me just ask you, this individual, so far as we know, there seems to be a personal motive, but we don't know why, after so many years, he decided to turn that grudge into outright violence. Do you think in the current atmosphere that journalists are working in the United States, the heated partisan atmosphere with specific rhetoric against journalists, that they need to take greater care when they encounter this kind of hostility?
Well, I think it's prudent for journalists in America to take responsible measures to protect yourself. But, you know, the sad truth is that journalists, like every other American, live in an environment in which we've seen mass shootings in movie theaters, in churches, and in schools. So we don't know the specific motive of this person or what made him do it that day. But I think, unfortunately, in our country, we're learning that no space is immune, not even a newsroom.
So the motive is, of course, unclear, but let's discuss maybe the context a little bit more. As Calev was mentioning, it's a very heated environment, and I mean specifically the administration. President Trump, of course, famously called journalists enemies of the state. His aversion to certain news networks isn't something that anyone can ignore. So the context in which this killing happened is also extremely important.
Well, it is, and you've identified absolutely the atmospherics, you know, the intense criticism, the outright dislike or even hatred for media today that I haven't seen in nearly 50 years in journalism, and perhaps maybe something close in the Nixon years. But again, you know, it's a long leap for me from being angry at me because I've written a news story or not liking my work and taking up a gun or a bomb and trying to kill me. You know, American journalists still operate in a very safe environment compared to many places around the world where, you know, you're really at risk of your life every single day.
Gene, you say it's a long leap, but is it now maybe more prudent? We know that this individual had been making social posts, social media. It is perhaps a tendency in the past, say, okay, readers tend, especially in the internet era, tend to get heated in this rhetoric, but now perhaps journalists have to be more prudent when they get that kind of information. Go to the police, try to press the police to investigate the source of that vitriol.
Oh, absolutely. I think this social media has proved to be a big echo chamber where maybe your views, as you said, might have been a one and off, you know, kind of comment now get echoed and amplified, and you hear from extremists who may not even know your name or know what your issue is, but who would feed that idea of hatred. So again, I think you're absolutely right. You know, while we live in a very safe environment in America generally, we know from what's happened across our society as well as this amplification aspect of social media, you really do have to be very prudent now, I think, about your safety.
Gene, you describe in your most recent article how just hours before that Annapolis shooting, you met with family members of journalists killed in Afghanistan in 2016. So when the news of this murder came in, it must have been doubly harrowing and shocking. Tell us more about that.
Well, you know, obviously my reaction is so infinitesimal compared to the tragedy and what the families must be feeling. But just 3 hours before I learned of Annapolis, going through the journalist memorial we have here, which recognizes journalists who've been killed in doing their job, I'm standing with the families of an NPR journalist, National Public Radio journalist in America, and an Afghan journalist who were killed together in Afghanistan 2 years ago. And they're asking me about the memorial, and I said, as I often do on this, you know, in America we live in a safe place, but it can happen here. Never dreaming that 3 hours later it would.
Gene, you mentioned that memorial at the museum. Our reporter Dan Raviv went to this ceremony I think it was just last week, was it? Or even within the last 2 weeks. He reported on it with us. What is it? I mean, we're seeing, it seems every corner of the world, journalists are now under more physical danger, and it seems now also in the United States to some degree.
Well, you're, again, absolutely right. You know, we see in Mexico, obviously in the Middle East, we see in the Ukraine, we see in Southeast Asia, that journalists are being targeted. You know, there was a time when the sides in a given argument or faction or war needed journalists to tell their story. So you were sort of in a protected group, sort of like a Red Cross or Red Crescent. And now, with the access directly through social media and the web to an audience, you're not just no longer neutral, you are a threat. So we see journalists increasingly being targeted by particularly terrorists who want to seize the narrative, and journalists are a threat to that. So, unfortunately, I think the job of covering conflict zones, of reporting on narco-terrorists, on criminal conduct, on repressive governments is even more dangerous around the world than ever before.
Gene, to what extent are you concerned that an attack like this could change the way journalists and journalism operate in the U.S.?
Well, thankfully, this is a rare occurrence, and the deaths after 9/11, in which the largest number of journalists died, which was 7 when the towers collapsed, including a freelance journalist and 6 technicians. The attacks here have tended to be more single and personal. So we did see 2 journalists be killed during a morning television program live on the air, but by a disgruntled colleague. So I think we're still relatively safe in America doing this, but I think journalists will be much more cautious now in terms of maybe reporting on civil disturbances, of going into areas where there are active shooters, because clearly being a journalist, having a notebook or a camera is no protection.
Okay, clearly not. Gene Policinski from the Newsroom there in Washington, D.C., thank you so much for joining us.